Guys, my muffler's loose. Now it's not even attached. Let's go ahead and fix it.
At around 15,000 miles, I noticed my muffler was flopping around, and I was thinking the bolt had just loosened up because that's happened before. But sadly, the actual mounting bracket was broken. My friend tried to weld it back together for me, but it didn't hold up after a few rides. It was a good attempt, and I'm thankful he was willing to help me out. I later learned how to weld myself because my bike frame is falling apart, and I've already fixed my cracked subframe brace. It doesn't look great, but so far it's held up after riding close to 500 miles. Before we get started, it's a good idea to wear safety glasses when working on your bike, and of course a welding helmet and gloves is a must when melting metal. My bike is almost always dirty, so I like to give it a good wash before doing most repairs. To get good access to the exhaust bracket, I'll have to disassemble part of the bike similar to the last video. I'll start by removing two 10mm bolts for the seat, and it pops up in the back and slides off. Two more 10mm bolts and my aftermarket rack can be removed. Remove the zip ties under the rear subframe and disconnect the taillight connector. Four more 10mm bolts and the taillight bracket can be removed. The rear fender unclips from each side, then it just lifts right off. I'll pull back the electrical tape and disconnect the connectors for my turn signals. These are also aftermarket connectors that I installed to make it easier to replace or remove them. I'll pull back the harness and unbolt four more 10s, and the subframe can be removed. I removed this 10mm bolt and the exhaust slides right off since the nut that holds the muffler on is no longer attached. I placed the muffler on the workbench and removed the bolt while holding the broken part of the bracket with some channel locks to keep it from spinning. Here's what that broken piece looks like up close, and it still fits nicely in the bracket. Those butt joint welds didn't work out too well, but I think I have a good idea of how to fix it so it doesn't quickly break again. Next, use an 8mm wrench to remove the battery terminals. Always remove the ground first and install the ground last, or you risk shorting out the battery with the wrench since the frame is grounded. Next, I'll squeeze and push back this clamp so I can remove the upper part of the fuel hose. I'll cover both sides with plastic baggies and rubber bands. This is to keep the dirt from falling in. Remove the two Phillips screws for the left side cover, and it rotates down and pops off the tank. The right side pulls off two grommets, then rotates down and pops off as well. Next, remove another 10mm for the tank, pull off the bracket and the rubber bushing, then lift up the tank in the rear and it just slides off. I didn't do this the last time I welded on my bike, but it's probably a good idea to disconnect the CDI module just in case because it's quite expensive. I also disconnected the rectifier as well because it's right there. I'll throw on my respirator and put a wire brush attachment into my drill. Make sure to always have power tools unplugged when swapping out or installing attachments. Next, I'll remove the paint on the subframe mount so it can be used as a good ground spot just like last time. Then I remove the paint on the exhaust bracket and on the subframe brace because there's a small stress crack near the nut that's just starting to form, and I didn't have a chance to weld it last video because I was in a hurry. I'll then remove as much paint as possible on the other side of these parts as well. I went ahead and bought a Harbor Freight rotary tool and a huge accessory kit. These things are super handy for all sorts of projects. I also purchased a high-quality tungsten carbide side cutting bit. This thing can cut through hardened steel without dulling. Next, I placed the broken nut and bracket in a vise, then bent it back into shape. Removed any old weld material and cleaned it up a bit. I cut out those big weld blobs on the bracket, then I used a small cone-shaped diamond-plated grinder to get into the corners a bit better. Next, I switched to a tiny steel brush and cleaned the rest of the paint off the broken pieces and everywhere I couldn't get with the bigger one. It seems that clean steel will weld better versus just trying to weld over paint. Next, I'll bend the bracket out a little bit because it appears to be pushed in a little further than it should be. And there we go, the broken piece fits up nicely. The welder I'll be using is a titanium aluminum flux 125, and I already showed how to set it up and get started in the last welding video. Before I welded my bike, I wanted to practice some more, so I welded a T-joint using 1/8 inch flat bar. I stopped about every inch of welding so I could clean the slag off, let it cool, and see how the welds were looking. In no way it looks perfect, but I don't think it turned out too bad. I definitely feel like I've improved a little bit. I also harvested some small 14 gauge plates from a steel bumper that was being thrown out, and I already removed the paint. It's a near perfect thickness match to what's used on the TW200. I cut one of the plates into 3 pieces and welded some T-joints and a lap joint using the stop and go method. You especially don't want to dwell too long on thinner metal like this or you will burn through it. Here's how it turned out. Next, I'll start with the top of the cross member. I used a diamond plated ball tip to create a little ditch on the crack. This just gives the weld a bit more surface area to grab onto, especially since I'll be grinding the top down. The bottom I'll just leave as is. I won't be drilling holes in the ends of the cracks like I did last time, mainly as a test to see what side will start to crack again. Drilling the ends makes sense to me, but some people have told me that it doesn't matter, so this will just be a good way to know for sure. Next, I covered the bike with a fiberglass blanket, connected the ground clamp, and cleaned the metal with some acetone. Make sure to never use chlorinated brake cleaner before welding, it can be dangerous. For some strange reason, I set my welder a little below the recommended setting for 14 gauge. I think I was afraid of melting through. Little by little, I ran a bead over the crack and used a wire brush on the drill to clean the slag off after each weld. And of course the weld didn't penetrate as much as I would have liked, but that's how you learn. It should still work because I will be grinding the top down and welding the backside. This is also when I noticed another small stress crack here, and that will also need to be welded. Next, I put the broken bracket and nut in position and held it in place with a magnet. I placed a tack weld on each side, but unfortunately the first time didn't work too well. I tried again with a little more dwell time and it worked much better. This is just to hold it in place for now. Next, I took that other 14 gauge plate, held it up in the back, and used a Sharpie to mark an approximate width of the channels on each side of the nut. I stuck it in a vise and used a cut-off wheel to slice off a piece along that marker line. Then I stuck that part back in the vise and cut it in half. Not exact, but it'll still work. I took those 2 pieces and held them up in the channels while putting markings on the top parts so I can cut an angle to allow them to line up with this bend in the bracket. I also made markings on where to begin cutting so they will fit flush in the channels. I used my angle grinder and tungsten carbide router bit to make small cuts and shape them. I basically went back and forth from the bike to the vise to measure and cut them, taking just a little off at a time. This is what I ended up with, and they lay nice and flat in each channel. No need to worry about the bottoms being too long for now. Back on the cross member, I dremeled out that other small stress crack, and this time I set my welder to the 14 gauge recommendation, but with a little higher voltage. After a few welds, it looks much better than the one that I did last night. Just remember, if you try to weld too much at one time with this thin stuff, you will melt a hole right through it. Next, I'll lay the bike down on the right side and just simply weld those cracks underneath. Here's what I ended up with. Doesn't look great again, but I think it's a lot better than the other side. I don't expect this to last forever, and I'll be adding reinforcement in the future, but I'm curious to how long this kind of repair will hold up over time. Moving back over to the muffler bracket, I'll position one of the supports I made and hold it in place with some vice grips while I lay down some tack welds. Then do the same with the other one and clean all the slag off. Then I welded it all together a little at a time, and this is what I ended up on the backside. Again, doesn't look great, there was a lot of spatter, but it should hold very well because the nut is welded to the supports and the supports to the bracket that wasn't broken. I wasn't able to get a good weld at the top because it was impossible to get the welding gun at the proper angle. I have learned that it's much easier to weld a simple joint on the bench versus actually welding something more complex like this. Next, I'll go ahead and flip the bike over to the other side, reposition the blanket, and make sure the ground clamp is connected. I then welded the cracks and the supports to the bracket, and here's what I'm left with. To finish this off, I'll slice off the ends of the supports with a cutoff wheel, then switch to a grinding wheel to grind the welds so they are flush with the bracket and round off any sharp edges. I'll pretty it up with a sanding wheel on the rotary tool and use a small diamond plated grinder to clean up the edges where the bolt inserts. I'll basically do the same thing to the top of the support so it's flat, but being careful not to take too much material off. Next, I'll run the correct taps through both screw holes to clean up the threads so the screws can thread in and out properly. The rear rack sits flush on the cross member and everything lines up. Then I'll test fit the exhaust. I found that after sliding it on and tightening the 10mm bolt, it works best if you remove the springs, bolt down the muffler, then reattach the springs afterwards.
And we're all done. I have a good feeling that this is gonna hold up nicely over time as long as I don't drop it way too much. And I'm not gonna paint it or put it back together just yet because I still have to weld the crack behind the right foot peg. But that will be in the next welding video, so I hope you guys found this one helpful, and I will see you later. Peace.